Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Philippine Event series of Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, hosted through the International Peace Foundation and hosted by De La Salle University, Manila, in cooperation with the Mapua Institute of Technology. My name is Tereso Tuliao Jr. of the Economics Department of De La Salle, Manila, and a fellow of the Yuchengco Center. And I will be your host this afternoon. May I invite you to rise for the invocation to be delivered by Brother Victor Franco, FSC, of the Board of Trustees of De La Salle, Manila.
Let us remember that we are in God's holy and loving presence. Gracious God, source of all that is good, each day you find ways of reminding us that all men and women share this one earth and are co-responsible with you for its development. As we discern how best to live and thrive in this increasingly complex and interdependent world, help us to work towards a state of affairs where globalization will lead to a narrowing of the scandalous divide between the rich and the poor, and enable all people to live dignified lives within their own cultural identities. Help us to ensure that the driving forces of development will not be the ideology of consumerism or the unrestrained lust for profit, but rather a genuine conviction of the solidarity of all peoples, an unyielding commitment to the dignity and rights of all, and an appreciation of all that is unique, diverse, and life-giving in every culture. Grant that one day we may indeed live on this earth as the sisters and brothers you call us to be. Amen.
Please remain standing for the singing of the Philippine National Anthem to be led by the De La Salle University Chorale.
Sa langit mong magaw, may dinagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning. Ang bituin at araw na kailan, huwag may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw na luwag ating pagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya ng magmay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
To formally welcome everyone to this afternoon's event is the President of the De La Salle University, Manila, Brother Armin Luistro, FSC.
Your Excellencies, beloved colleagues in academe, friends and partners in business, industry, and government service, beloved students and guests. The Global Competitiveness Report for 2007 and 2008 of the World Economic Forum ranks the Philippines at number 71 among 131 countries, while our ASEAN neighbors continue to overtake us, with Singapore at rank 7, Malaysia at 21, Thailand at 28, and even Vietnam at 68. The report notwithstanding, the National Statistics Coordination Board reports that for the second quarter this year, our gross domestic product posted an impressive 7.5% growth in the second quarter of 2007, from 5.5% last year. It also reported continued inflow of remittances from overseas workers, resulting in a hefty 16.6% expansion in the net factor income from abroad, and pushed the gross national product to an 8.3% growth, a substantial improvement over the 6.4% growth in the same quarter last year. More recently, after breaching the psychological barrier of 43-1 against the US dollar, the Philippine peso is today the best performing currency in Asia. Dear friends, against this backdrop of the Philippine economy, we are pleased to invite you to a fresh look at what globalization has in store for us and for our children. My field is not in economics, although as a Filipino educator, I am certainly most interested to listen to the vision and insights of Professor Mundell as I engage my colleagues in academe and our institutional partners in a fruitful dialogue, hopefully not just today, but also in the coming months, so that we could together envision a more effective strategy for sustained development for our beloved country, and most especially for the last, the lost, and the least among our people. For after all, the mission of universities must necessarily include national development goals. I am especially grateful to the International Peace Foundation for its efforts to facilitate and strengthen dialogue between societies in the region as well as the peoples of the world through this Bridges program. In cooperation with the Mapua Institute of Technology, De La Salle University, Manila is a proud host today of the first Nobel laureate to ever visit our campus, as he shares with us many fruitful years of research, teaching, and consulting in the field of economics. To the great thinker of the past century, Albert Einstein, is attributed this saying: "Imagination is more important than knowledge." Dear friends, more than just sharing with us the knowledge he has developed and evolved through the years in the field of international economics, our distinguished lecturer brings with him the conviction that we can be active participants in the construction of a world better than when we found it. On behalf of the students, alumni, faculty, and staff of De La Salle University, Manila, I welcome you all warmly to our academic community and invite you to enter into the realm of the imagination so we could begin to recreate a world that is befitting for humanity. It is my hope that we would end our day with a firm conviction that the future is here. Maraming salamat at mabuhay kayong lahat.
Thank you very much, Brother Armin. To tell us more about the Bridges program, may I call on stage the Chairman of the Board of Directors of the International Peace Foundation, Mr. Uva Moravets.
Magandang hapon po, and welcome to the first ASEAN-wide event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the common patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including the country's major universities, and I would like to thank De La Salle University and its president, Brother Armin Luistro, for hosting the event today. Starting this November, Bridges will be continuously held in the Philippines and Thailand until April 2008, involving the participation of Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. The first ASEAN-wide series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. It follows a series of 250 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand between November 2003 and April 2005. Bridges has been established as an international, intercultural, and interdisciplinary platform for creative cultures of learning and continued education for all people. The International Peace Foundation has no concept for peace and no fixed solution how to achieve peace, but we believe the first step towards peace is dialogue, and the first step towards dialogue is respect. The International Peace Foundation doesn't take sides, but acts as a mediator by creating an independent platform for dialogue where people meet who normally don't meet. People from all walks of life, people who speak different languages, even if they speak the same. As politicians speak another language than artists, and business and religious leaders another one than scientists, it is seldom that they speak with each other or even work together. We live in a world where some people pretend to know the answers and solutions, how to solve problems, how to achieve peace, though the quest for peace lies in the art to pose the right questions. The International Peace Foundation believes that the interconnected problems of our world today cannot be solved only by politicians, only by business, only by scientists, or by religion alone, but by working together. In the Bridges event series, people from all walks of life meet in a multidisciplinary program to find creative solutions to solve problems and to achieve peace. Peace within ourselves, within our family, within social structures, peace with nature and the environment, peace between nations, cultures, and religions. Peace is a process. Dialogue is a process. It is nothing which can be achieved instantly, it needs time. This is why Bridges is not organized as a single conference, but as a series of events over the period of 6 months, in which Nobel laureates from all fields build bridges with leaders in all parts of society and with the general public. Peace is not something which can be left to the elite of a few, but which needs the participation of everyone. Only if many ways cross and people walking these ways meet, can international understanding be achieved and problems commonly solved. If we listen to and learn from each other, we may discover that there is not only one way to achieve peace, but that there are many ways, and certainly ways we have never thought of to go. It is my pleasure to invite you today to listen to and share your views with Professor Robert Alexander Mundell, the 1999 Nobel laureate for economics, who has agreed to come to the Philippines without any honorarium to help build bridges. We all look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution. Mabuhay and welcome, Professor Mundell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moravec. To introduce our guest of honor and keynote speaker, may I present Dr. Reynaldo Vea, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Mapua Institute of Technology.
Good afternoon. It is my honor to be introducing this afternoon's guest speaker. But considering that his curriculum vitae will be heavily cited in the conferment ceremonies to follow the lecture this afternoon, and considering the stature of our speaker, suffice it for me to say the following. Ladies and gentlemen, the 1999 Nobel Laureate for Economics at Columbia University in New York, Professor Robert Alexander Mundell.
Mr. Chairman, Brother Armin, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in the Philippines and to talk on this subject. I'm grateful to the Peace Foundation for presenting this opportunity for me. And I'm going to talk on a subject that you see, currency issues and trade issues in the world as a whole. Start off with this preamble about the world economy. The world economy is in great shape right now. Even we hear a lot of bad news about it, but 2007 is unique in history in that it's the first time that you've had all the major economies of the world hitting on four cylinders, you might say. The rapid expansion of growth. That includes the United States and Canada, North America, you see, and Europe and Japan and China. These the big four countries now. China's now one of the big four with a GDP that's now reached $3 trillion. And then the emerging market countries, what used to be called the BRIC countries, but it's really, we have to bump China up into the top class and think of the BRIM countries, B-R-I-M, for Brazil, Russia, India, and Mexico is the new. Those 8 countries are all moving forward very rapidly. And even though there are troubles in it, because economists always talk about the good things and bad things, on the one hand this, on the one hand that, we have to notice that it's never happened before in history that we have that kind of situation. Now, this is a pictorial view of the world economy. It's of the globes or circles represent monetary power, more or less proportionate to countries' GDPs. So the biggest monetary power is the United States with a GDP of $14 trillion. The second biggest is the Euro area with a GDP of 11 trillion. And the third is the yen with a GDP of, up in the upper left there, with a GDP of 4.5 trillion. And then the fourth is now the Chinese area, the RMB area, of 3 trillion. And then the fifth would be the UK, still outside the Eurozone, with 2.5 trillion. Of course, if we lump the UK in with the Euro area, the whole GDP of the European Union becomes certainly comparable to that of the United States. Well, that's a picture of this. Why are we getting this prosperity? We need to look at that. First, of course, this long period of peace. And we have, of course, peace is never complete. It's always a question of degree, but it's comparative peace. Robust growth in the United States, China's spectacular growth, U.S. deficits and world liquidity, because the U.S. deficits, well, from the United States point of view, may seem to be bad, although not as bad as you might think. From the global standpoint, they provide the world with the fuel for economic growth, the great liquidity that those countries have is a reflection of that. Last year at the IMF meetings a year ago in Singapore, the big subject was the problem of the International Monetary Fund. It was making losses. They weren't balancing their books because they weren't lending to anybody. Nobody needed to borrow. And the world was in such great shape. That's the first time that's happened. And that's a reflection of that. That is because of the liquidity that's provided by the United States deficit to a large extent. Of course, there was a liquidity crisis in August, and you all heard about the subprime mortgage market. That went down, and that created a sudden panic in Europe in August. But the European Central Bank reacted to that with such alacrity. They issued 94 billion euros, about $130 billion in one day. And then that was the time zone. The United States came in later with another $25 billion worth. So you got the crisis and then the quick reaction to the crisis, which made it a non-crisis to a certain extent. Of course, all those people that are stuck with subprime mortgage are making losses, and that's going to have some, and has had some effect on the stock markets and so on. Nevertheless, it's we got through that period. Then you have the global spread of the IT productivity gains. Information technology is spreading around, increasing, and it's nothing looks as if it's going to stop. And then the last part is the IT. What if I put that over? Maybe it would not. I better leave it. Leave well enough alone. The IT tech catch-up. It won't reach over here, will it? No. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there. I'll come over here like this so I can see it. All right, then. Wait a minute. Oh, there we are. Okay, then. Now, so these trends in the world economy, drivers: globalization, IT revolution, success of the euro, the rise of Asia, and then high energy, high raw material prices. These are 5 key things we have to bear in mind when we make any assessment. Globalization started with the end of the Cold War. It started in 1990 when the Cold War ended, and the globalization that had already occurred over the IMF world and added to by China after China entered that world in 1980 became more or less complete with the addition of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Soviet Union, all those new states that all now are participating in it. It's a natural state of the world when it's not split up into blocks, and we're in it now. So this is a key element. Every country has to adapt to it in its own way. The second is the IT revolution, which is increasing productivity, lowering costs in every aspect of economic life, in firms, households, institutions, and governments. And even if we got no new technology, just for the rest of the century, the spread of that, the deepening of that revolution permeating every aspect of economic life. Right here, this is part of it. Right here, what I'm doing is a big factor in the technology. The third factor is the euro. The euro area makes a kind of revolution in the global system because it's, for the first time, it creates a chance for a change in the power configuration of the international monetary system. You can look at the world as a succession of big countries. You saw that chart I had, that with the globe, that United States, the biggest area there, go back 2 centuries and it was a little country of 4 million people. And then it rose rapidly. By the time of the World War I, it had become bigger than the next 3 biggest economies put together. In 1914, the United States GDP was bigger than Britain's, plus Germany's, plus France, the next 3 biggest economies by measured GDP at that time. And then what that meant with the war, the pound sterling, which had been the great currency of the past, was replaced by the dollar. And the dollar all through the 20th century was the dominant currency. All those big changes that occurred in the international monetary system, we talk about the breakdown of Bretton Woods, we talk about the Plaza Accord, the creation, all those things are minor compared to the underlying change in the power configuration of the system, which that's why I call the euro the second most important monetary event in the 20th century. Some people say I do it that way because some people call me the father of the euro. That's not the reason. The reason is that, well, the first thing you have to ask is, what was the first most important monetary event? And I think that was the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the creation of a central bank for what was already by far the biggest economy in the world, and which gave the U.S. the ability to manage the international monetary system for the 20th century. So the euro is a new thing because it creates an alternative to the dollar. It's not going to replace the dollar, but it's an alternative to it. And that's important. Then the fourth thing is the rise of Asia. And I won't spend any time talking about that because you know the huge, great success of China, now a $3 trillion economy, and with a rising per capita income of $2,500 to $3,000, still very low, 1/10 of what is true in the developing countries, but formidable in the total power that is reflected in China with its now $1.4 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. And then recently, this high energy and raw material prices. Part of that comes from uncertainty, political uncertainty. People say there's about 30 or 40 billion dollars in the oil price due to the uncertainty connected with the Middle East and the areas with Iran and so on. But there's something new in it. It's really reflected in the fact that the increase in China's, this is a figure that Martin Wolf brought out in a column, the increase in China's oil imports since 2002, in the last 5 years, is equivalent to all of Japan's imports. It sort of crystallizes that fact, that enormous impact of an effect on energy prices. So the demands for energy are very high. Now, I believe energy prices are going to come down, and I'm optimistic about that. Optimistic from a standpoint of an oil buyer, pessimistic maybe from an oil seller. This gives a picture of the growth rate, the stellar growth rate of China since 1978. On the top, the blue area, and on the bottom is the U.S. growth rate, the biggest economy in the world. And this is a great period for the United States, because this great period included the supply-side revolution of the 1980s with a tremendous expansion, and then that wonderful record-breaking 10-year expansion of the 1990s. We've had a recession in 1990 and 91, and another recession in 2001 and 2002. But the long period has been expansion, and we've been in expansion. These are the major, the GDPs of the biggest economies. I indicated that so far. But China is the big world manufacturing center, and China's got all kinds of reasons you can put behind the success of China. An important part of it, though, has been foreign direct investment, FDI, which brings to the country and was the star thing in making for China's rapid exports. It brings capital and technology and markets all at the same time. So these are, along with other factors, very important. In China, well, we're here to look at that. Population will rise, expected to rise to 1.54, and then that's 2042, and then fall to 1.2 by the end of this century. That should be a zero in that thing there. Big demographic shifts taking place in China with the extreme aging of the population, creates a risk of cities filled with old people with inadequate means of support and education. But that's the problem. Now, getting to the thing that is more of an anticipation of the subject is U.S. deficits, the global imbalances in general. U.S. deficits are part of that. That chart starts in 1990 and goes there. It's actually very misleading because it looks as if the deficits of the United States started in 1990. That's not true at all. If you go back to the 1980s, there were big deficits then too. Not quite as big, but they were very big deficits as a share of GDP. The U.S. deficits have been very large since about 1975, 1980, 1990, all the way through one single year once they ended, and now they're bigger. They've grown up here. So there's a long-term facet that's involved in the creation of those U.S. deficits. By and large, if you look at the whole U.S. economy intertemporally, looking back on it, in the 19th century, the United States was a capital importer and had deficits. And in the run-up in the first, by the 1900, they'd become a trade balance surpluses because they had to repay interest on the debts. Then in World War I, the Britain and France and the European belligerents had to sell off their assets, and the U.S. became a creditor. It was a creditor and then a surplus. From 1915 until 1975, the U.S. had surpluses, and it became the biggest creditor in the world. And since 1975, it's had deficits, and now is the biggest debtor in the world. So these are long-term movements that are not governed by trivial changes in exchange rates or interest rates or anything like that. They're vital forces moving inside the economy and connected with the global economy. Oil surpluses are the biggest counterparts of those big deficits of the United States now. $600 billion in oil surpluses. Japan's surpluses have gone on for a long period of time, $150, $170 billion in that order of magnitude. Then China's surpluses are very large now, but they're very recent. So I put that on partly to show that the problems of the world and the main problem of the deficits are not necessarily China's fault. China's a part of them, but the deficits have been there for a long time. This is the exchange rate picture of the world. And what we see from it, I think those blue lines mark it. Those blue patches there are recession years. This table starts, so you can't see it here, the thing, it's off the mark, but it starts in 1970. So it's going back 37 years up to the present, more or less the present, not quite, to last year. And then you had the big recession in 74. And then you had recession in 82. And then you had a recession in 91, 9-month recession. And then you had another recession in 2002. So those are things, but this is still not a bad period in this period. But the red line is the price of the euro, or the euro didn't begin until 1999, but the predecessor of euro was the European Currency Unit, a basket of the European currencies that in 1999 turned into the euro. And so you see this strong period of the in the early part, late 1970s, of the euro or of the ECU with a weak dollar. So when that goes up, it means a weak dollar. So a weak dollar going up to 1980. Then the U.S. had bad period of inflation in a peacetime period. 1979 to 81 were 3 years of two-digit inflation. And then Reaganomics came in, big tax cuts, a more efficient economy combined with tight money to stop the inflation. And the dollar soared, the euro went way down, and the U.S. expansion became very large. And at that point, having got the inflation rate down to 4% by 1984, the United States had to organize the G5 meeting that at the Plaza Accord, that to depreciate the dollar, because the tight money in the 1980s had appreciated the dollar, and that had done its job of getting the inflation rate down. But having done that, the inflation rate was overvalued, and so there had to be a big depreciation of the dollar, and that did occur over the next few years. And then, as we go on in the 1980s, in the 1990s, you had very strong dollar expansion because the tax cuts in the 1980s, combined with the inventions, the computers, the internet, all those things made the Silicon Valley IT revolution, almost doubling the growth rate in the United States. Dollar was soaring over this period, and the euro was then plummeting over that period. And then that gravy train came to an end. It was the end of that boom, overexpansion in the IT sector, a stock market crash. You had a short recession again, and the dollar went way down over that period, and you had the euro coming way up, and that's been the trend we're in more or less now at the present time. We look at, this picture shows the global imbalances. The blue part there, the light blue, is the U.S. deficit. And then the yellow parts are the oil surpluses, and then comes Japan and China here, and then that counts for the major counterparts of those deficits. But what that shows is that the major part of those global imbalances facing the United States are really oil surpluses, not. Then China and Japan are important, but nobody thinks Japan has had big surpluses for now over $100 billion for 25 years, going back to 1980. It's a demographic shift, an excess of saving over Japan. As people are getting older, they've been saving for their retirement, and as the population is older, they're going to have a nest egg of built-up capital abroad, about $2 trillion worth, that they can draw upon the interest on that to supplement their savings. That's the process. So the exchange rate, the currency of the yen, appreciated threefold in the 1980s to 1990s. They went from the dollar went from 240 yen down to 80 yen. It tripled, the yen tripled against the dollar. The dollar went to 1/3 against the yen over that period, but it didn't change the trade balances, because exchange rates are not the story about trade balances. Just imagine if you had a common currency in the whole world, you'd still have trade balances due to demographic changes and investment flows and all these other things, but you'd have no exchange rate changes. So exchange rates are not a factor directly connected with trade balances. Now, I'm not going to go into these charts on the real exchange rate. That will take me beyond, but I'll just go to, let's see, talking about adjustment. I want to talk about adjustment because that's important. To put it in the current focus is, what should countries do when they're faced with some disequilibrium, when they're faced with a surplus? The first thing to be very clear on is you can't just say, suppose there's a surplus, then what are we going to do? You have to see what's the counterpart of the surpluses. Because in the global economy, there's everything is connected together. In fact, if you talk about the U.S. trade balance, this $900 billion thing, you can measure that in no fewer than 16 ways. 16 ways of doing it. I'm going to bore you for a moment with those 16 ways, but it's easier than it seems, because the trade balance is equal to the difference between exports and imports. That's a no-brainer. That's the definition of it. But it's also equal to the difference between income and spending, just as an individual is. If you have a surplus, expenditure is great. If you yourself have a surplus, you're spending less than your income, and it's the same for a country. If you have a deficit, you're spending more than your income. So income minus domestic expenditure, or total spending, sometimes called absorption. And that used to be called the absorption approach to the balance of payments. Then the balance of trade, any trade deficit has to be financed. It's got to have its counterpart in, if a country is importing more than it's exporting, it's got to be either borrowing or it's got to be using up reserves. Again, just like an individual. So that's a third approach. And then the fourth approach comes from this accounting law, which we call Walras law, that the sum of all expenditures, sum of all spending has to be zero if you count money in that. So what that really says is that it's like total internal saving. It says if inside a country they've got an excess demand for foreign assets in money, including money, foreign financial assets including money, that country has a trade surplus because they can only buy something abroad if they're selling something. And the way you sell something is having a trade surplus. If a country is the opposite, they have to be financing something. If a country has an import deficit, they have to be financing it somehow. Now, you don't know whether the financing caused the deficit or the deficit caused people to go out and borrow money in order to finance it. All you know is that those have to be the same. So there you have four clear approaches to the balance of payments. You get 8 by multiplying by 2. It's easy enough because everything that you do here inside your country has its counterpart in the rest of the world. The balance of payment surplus of the Philippines is exactly the same as the balance of payments deficit of the rest of the world with the Philippines. Now, nobody would try to calculate the Philippine surplus by looking at the rest of the world's deficit. They wouldn't do that because the Philippines is too small a country. But in the United States, which is maybe 22% of the world economy, that $900 billion deficit, you have to look at the rest of the world's surplus. That's what that chart I put on that showed that surplus is. So every one of those four approaches has its counterpart in the rest of the world. That makes 8. Well, how do we get 16? Again, multiply by 2. Because time goes on in economics, and everything today and in the past has its counterpart in the future. It's like saying anyone who borrows today and therefore is enabled to run a deficit has to run a surplus in the future in order to repay the loan and the interest on that loan. And that's true with every country too. At least the expectation has to be the same. Of course, you can have defaults. There was a big global default in 1982, and there have been a few in history that have taken place, and so that it doesn't work, those intertemporal things. But that's whenever we talk about a system not being sustainable, we're using these other 8 approaches to the balance of payments, which is the intertemporal approaches. Well, now, I don't want to go into the details of this. I've gone through a kind of discussion here saying no disequilibrium can exist in isolation. Any deficit, any disequilibrium in the economy has to have an equal and opposite disequilibrium elsewhere in the economy. You might think that sounds like Newton's second or third law. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It is the same. Essentially, it's the same, but it's the economic counterpart of it. Any disequilibrium has its equal and opposite disequilibrium elsewhere, and it matters a lot where that other disequilibrium is, and analysis has to take that into account. Well, now, here's what I think is the most interesting part, I think, for, say, the Philippines, to analyze the effect of it. What happens if you have an increase in saving? If suddenly you have an increase in saving in the Philippines, that saving means people spend less, and so there's more room for an export surplus. Exports may go out if the goods are in elastic supply. And at the same time, that creates, if you have an increase in saving, that has to have a be manifested in two ways, either an increase in the demand for money or an increase in the demand for bonds or some kind of securities, some kind of financial assets. That's the increase. So if you have an increase in saving, you have an increase in demand for money, let's say. Just to be simple about it. And then you have an excess supply of goods, your trade surplus, and the money comes in, the dollars come in. The central bank, if it's fixing the exchange rate, has to buy up those dollars. It produces pesos, and then the people get the money they want. That's the counterpart of their savings. There's no inflationary aspect connected with that, because the demand for money that people have wanted, or it could be a demand for securities, has its counterpart that the money they're getting has its counterpart in an increase in demand for money. So if the Philippines buys up dollars and the central bank buys that up and produces those dollars, it becomes reserves of the banks and increases the money supply, that's not inflationary if the surplus has been caused by an increase in savings, because it has its counterpart in an increase in demand. It's like in China, every year, China has whopping surplus. $200 billion a year over the incredible surplus. These are dollar surpluses in dollars, and the central bank buys up those dollars, and that satisfies the demand, but then the central bank thinks that the production of those dollars is going to cause inflation, so it sterilized it by selling dollars, creating a surplus next year because the people want the extra money and they're not getting it. And this is the point that's important. Now, I know that the cause of the deficit, you don't think the cause of the deficit is a spontaneous increase in saving. Let me see. Let me just look at this, and we'll go into it. I think you may think of it as an increase in capital imports, maybe more relevant. But think for a minute about what happens in Hong Kong or Panama. Hong Kong, Panama have a fixed exchange rate. And they have a fixed exchange rate that people believe is going to stay. They think that for the time being, there's no good speculating on a change in the exchange rate in Hong Kong or in Panama. So there's no speculative capital movements that come in. Any capital that comes in, they come in because they can earn more in Hong Kong, or because there's a demand for money in Hong Kong that wants that money to come in. And so there's no disequilibrium in Hong Kong any more than there is a disequilibrium between California and New York, or between Ireland and Germany, both of which are part of the same monetary area now. You don't get that disequilibrium. But now, it's a common misconception that Asia crisis, for example, was caused by fixed exchange rates. I'll give this illustration. Nothing could be further from the truth. Singapore and Hong Kong had fixed or quasi-fixed exchange rates, but did not experience the crisis. The Asian crisis was caused by the devaluation of the RMB in 1994. The dollar went from 5.5 RMB to 8.7 in 1994. And that was done under IMF auspices. And then it was too much. They also liberalized the capital account. It was too much, so the price level went up after that devaluation by 25% in 1994 and 15% in 1995. So it was about a 50% or 60% devaluation, and you had a 40% increase in prices in the next 2 years, showing that devaluation was excessive and a mistake. But China's history since in the past 15 years has included a 25% inflation and a 15% inflation. Since that time, during the Asian crisis, China said it's not going to devalue, and other people were expecting it to devalue. And as soon as the Prime Minister said that, immediately everything came back into place again. Foreign direct investment came back into China, and the Chinese economy worked very well. And China kept that fixed exchange rate at 8.28 to the dollar to the letter until July 2005. All through that period, from 1997 to 2005, and even today, China had a lower average inflation rate than any of the G7 countries. By fixing the exchange rate, they had a better inflation result than those countries that were doing inflation targeting, the European Union, the United States, and Britain, and so on, and Japan. So now, one cause was the RMB, and the second cause was the big instability of the yen-dollar rate. The two biggest exchange rates in Asia, the two most important exchange rates in Asia, are the RMB dollar exchange rate and the yen dollar exchange rate. And what happened to that? Well, in 1995, at the end of the Plaza Accord, the dollar had dropped to 78 yen. I said 80 just to be round number before. 78 yen was the low point. And from April 1995 until June 1998, the dollar soared against the yen from 78 yen to 148 yen. This is an increase in the devaluation of the Japanese yen in Asia here by 60%. Tremendous depreciation. So the two biggest currency areas, China and Japan, devalued, enormous devaluations over that period, and it was that instability that made it Southeast Asia all priced out of the market because they hadn't shared in the big expansion that took place in the United States, and they were fixed to the dollar, and so their exchange rates had to go way down, and there was no way they could get out. It was the instability of the dollar-yen exchange rate, particularly, and then the devaluation of the dollar. But when you read the newspapers by the official institutions, when they're doing all the analysis of it, first of all, no one at those institutions predicted the crisis, and second, after the crisis, all they could say it was caused by crony capitalism, or they said fixed exchange rates. And they wouldn't mention the real cause of it, which was the devaluation of the RMB and the extreme depreciation of the Japanese yen. Now, here's what I wanted to talk about with respect to the Philippines, the capital inflow, maybe. There you say there's capital inflow comes into the Philippines. Now, for that capital inflow to the Philippines, from what I said before, you really have to look what generated it in the rest of the world. Because you don't get a capital inflow without a counterpart in that in the rest of the world. There has to be some displacement of it. To get a capital outflow from the United States or from Japan or something, you have to have increased saving there, which creates the potential for a surplus. Now, if the capital comes, so there's a release of goods from that, but let's leave that aside as outside the framework we're going to think about. Now, the capital comes in, and then the foreigners are buying pesos with dollars so they can buy domestic bonds. That's what they want. The central bank then buys the dollars to prevent peso appreciation. Doesn't want the industry to become too uncompetitive. So it doesn't want, might go up, let it go up a little bit, but doesn't let it go up very much. So they stabilize the peso, and the pesos are put in the hands of foreigners. Now, the belief is that means inflation. If they buy up this means inflation. They can't do it. Well, what happens? The process. The foreigners now take the pesos that they've got from this. They need the pesos to buy the bonds, and then they offer to buy the bonds they want, or whatever securities. We're calling all securities bonds in this case. So they raise the offer price for bonds in order to induce people to sell from them. And then firms now engaged, encouraged by the lower interest rate, because an increase in the price of the securities or lower interest rate, they offer bonds for sale to foreigners. Or people with existing bonds could sell foreigners. It wouldn't be any different. But the extra spending by firms then sell bonds, and they use this for increased investment. They increase their spending. Part of that goes on imports and on exportable goods, releasing exports available. Part of it could also go into domestic goods. And in that sense, this would tend to cause a change in the real exchange rate. But the real exchange rate will improve to some extent unless the there's an elastic supply of domestic goods in it. As long as the capital imports continue, there'll be a trade deficit equal to the capital flow. And as long as the domestic demand for money is unchanged, the supply of money will remain what it was originally. The capital inflow involves an equal transfer of real resources, as explained in the vast literature on the transfer problem. Now, there was 2 centuries there's been an argument over the transfer problem. In 1752, David Hume wrote his essay on money a long way back. And what he did was to show there's an automatic equilibrating mechanism to the balance of payments. He wanted to say that governments never have to worry about the balance of payments because it automatically corrects itself. And this was a world where people fixed the price of one or both metals, either gold or silver. So they had fixed exchange rates between them. And he showed what that adjustment mechanism is. Now, in his discussion of it, he starts off, in the initial draft of this, he started off saying, well, if a country has a surplus, the price level would rise, and the other country would have a deficit, and the price level would fall, and that'll cause a shift of demand. That was the first draft he wrote of it, and then he sent that to his friend James Oswald, and he got back a critique of it. And Oswald said, how can prices rise when maybe domestic goods prices could rise, but most goods couldn't rise? So Hume revised that draft, and he said now the prices can't rise. They won't rise. They don't have to rise. And this is the way this came out. But the way it was interpreted in the 19th century literature were 2 schools of thought. There was one group of thought that said if it's like if one country lends another country some money, the country that lends the money increases its saving, the other country decreases its saving, and the new country buys more in both goods, and the other country buys less of both goods, and there's an automatic transfer that's equal to the whole thing is transferred, and there's no equilibrium. There's no need for a change in the prices that take place here. And then that became debated in the early 20s. People forgot about some of the literature there, and the argument came up again between Keynes and Olean in the 1920s. Olean won that argument hands down. Keynes just made a mistake in it, and that was it. But what that crude idea of almost talking about the quantity of money as an independent thing is still brandished about and widely used. People think that a capital flow to a country means inflation in that country. Now, you have all kinds of examples where that can't be the case, and it isn't the case. First of all, you have, if there's a capital flow from New York to California, you have the Californians spend more, the New Yorkers spend less, trade balances take place, and there's no change in inflation in other area. There's no change in relative. There could be shifts of demand because the new country, California, may not buy the same goods that New York does without, but there's no necessary shift in demand. Now, so that's where I'm going to leave it. I mentioned the 16 approaches here. What I wanted to do, though, to leave with you here for those economists that are interested in studying this issue, at least my take on it and so on, I put some references there on which I spent a long time talking about those 4 references there that would that go through that, and I hope that you can distribute that. If you need it, you can have it, and I'm sure we can make it so that you can get those references in detail, and that's the basic argument. My basic argument is that any country can be like Hong Kong. Any country can be like China was when they kept their currency fixed and have a stable price level. The only thing is, if you keep your currency fixed to another currency, a big currency like the United States dollar, as long as that dollar is stable itself, that country is going to be stable. One example is Panama, which has kept the dollar. It has its own currency, the Balboa, but it's equal to a dollar, and it's only a coin. So it's always convertible into the dollar. And they've had that since Panama became a country. At the time, the United States wanted to create the Panama Canal and recognized Panama as an independent country with the revolution was formerly part of Colombia. So in that treaty in 1904, the Panama said it would not create a paper currency. Now, it's had opportunities since that time. Anytime it wants, it can change that treaty, but it had the benefit of that system, has now had it for 103 years, and throughout that whole period, Panama has had the inflation rate of the United States, just including too much inflation during World War I, deflation in the Great Depression, too much inflation in World War II, and some secular inflation in this period. But it's got the best price level record of any Latin American country, and it's because it did this. So China and all the Gulf states now were and are tied to the dollar. Now, if, though, the dollar is unstable, then this will cause too much inflation. This will create a problem. If the dollar is deflation, this will create deflation. There is now a dollar cycle. The dollar goes down. I showed the chart, and it went down in the 70s, up in the early 80s, went down till 1995, then it went up again until 2001, and then it went down, and it's in the downward period now. It recovered a bit, and then it went down again. So it goes up and down with recovery and other things like that. And when it does go up, when the dollar goes up, and it's strong, it creates deflation on countries that are fixing to it. Not big deflation. It created in China 1% deflation. It created in Hong Kong a little bit of deflation. It created in Panama some deflation. And it created in Ecuador, which is dollarized, some deflation. And it created in the Gulf states a little bit, but not more than 1% a year. It was a little blemish. And then when the dollar depreciated, the inflation rate came up to 3%, 4% in China in 2004. Then it came back down again to about 2 or 3%, and it's currently going up a bit, even though China's been appreciating the currency since that time. It's still going up a little bit now. So there is a problem. So I'm not saying just fix the dollar. If the fluctuations in the inflation rate that gives you are more than you want to have. The antidote to it would be, in my opinion, would be to think in terms of the ASEAN countries, the countries nearby, look in terms of what's been happening to Malaysia and Thailand, countries like that, the inflation rate, the appreciation rate of those countries, and China itself has been around 5%. And the Philippines, I guess, is in this category. But there's an alternative to it that would let Philippines and the ASEAN countries move in the direction of a monetary union, not a single currency monetary union, but in the direction of a stable exchange rate currency area, which is probably the best thing approach to take. The dollar cycle, then, to get rid of that. And the way to do that would be to take a basket, make a basket of. We're now, with the creation of the euro, to a certain extent, in a bipolar world. Dollars and euros are the two dominant currencies. In the previous period, the IMF used 5 currencies. They started off with a 16 currency basket, came to a 5 currency basket. When the euro came into being, it came to a 4 currency basket. But I think now, with the success of the euro, a 2 currency basket of the dollar and the euro is enough. And it would be a good idea to have about 60% dollars and 40% euros. This would be a good thing for this. Now, let's look at that. The euro-dollar basket A basket of the dollar would mitigate the dollar cycle problem. A weight of 60% for the dollar and 40% for the euro would be desirable. This could be approximated by a basket of $2 plus €1, giving the dollar a weight of 57% and the euro 43%. Not bad. A very simple basket. Everybody can understand it. The dollar is about the euro is about $1.47 now. This is a very convenient basket. $2 plus €1. It conforms of the global reserves in the world now, $5 trillion. About $4 trillion are held in US dollars, $1 trillion in other currencies, mainly euros. So this is a good basket that conforms to reality, and if it's needed in the future, it could be changed. But here's the argument I'm making, that what instead of going through the IMF and trying to enact a big treaty, complicated treaty, use an informal approach, and just among central bankers, just decide if that's good for the Philippines. Try that basket, stabilizing to that basket, and try to sell that. Ask other members of the ASEAN group that are doing similar things if that would work for them, and try it out and see if it works, and then that would be a way you could get back to a kind of stability among the ASEAN countries, stability also pretty close to stability to at least that new basket, that euro dollar, that combination of the dollar and the euro, that would be something different from the pure dollar standard, but it would mitigate the problems if the dollar does get weak. Remember, there is an argument you can make that there'll be a nagging tendency for some overhang, some weakness of the dollar over the next 5 years. Why? Because with the EU, as more and more countries are coming into the European Monetary Union, 9 countries are in the ERM. They're going to, seven countries are in the ERM. They're going to be lining up for getting into the EU, the EMU, the Monetary Union. So soon there's going to be 15 or 20 countries in the Monetary Union. This area is getting larger. People are going to then want to keep gradually in their reserves maybe about half dollars and half euros. But right now they're 80% in dollars. So people are going to be, whenever they get a chance, whenever the dollar gets strong enough, whenever the euro gets weak enough, they'll try to gradually diversify and get a better balance. That's going to have a nagging added supply of dollars in the global world that's going to keep the dollar down lower than it otherwise would be, and that would be that's why this would be a good idea to do this. It gives some kind of insulation to it. So that's what I would suggest. Now, in my own work, I have a conference every year on global money in Siena, where I live in the summer and other times, and it's people. Our group really believes in a big reform, a global reform that includes a global money, a world money, and this is not just an abstract ivory tower economist like myself, but people like Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, is an absolute advocate of this proposal, this idea of a global money. So I think. But every country should start to think in terms of a better system, because we don't have a good system now with these huge swings in the dollar-euro rate are very uncomfortable. In fact, they're uncomfortable for Europe, and they're uncomfortable for the International Monetary Fund, because the managing director of the International Monetary Fund came out and said the dollar is undervalued. But the IMF staff came back and said the dollar is overvalued. So there's conflict there. Mr. Rato, the outgoing managing director, is from Spain. The Europeans think the dollar is undervalued. And other people, the IMF thinks it's overvalued. It's a question of how you do, and the overvaluation, undervaluation criterion that they're using with the new revised rules of surveillance at the IMF are related to trade balances. But this is not a good approach, because trade balances don't determine exchange rates. And if you think they do, just think about the fact that Germany has a surplus today of $180 billion, and it doesn't have a currency. It uses the euro. And Spain has a deficit of $90 billion, and it doesn't have a currency, so you can't say those countries should change their exchange rates. That's determined by capital flows. You get that because Germans have been buying up since the monetary union, beachfront properties in Spain and things like that, and this is a natural capital flow. It has nothing to do with exchange rates. Well, then that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to leave time for questions. I'll just say that the euro-dollar basket would stabilize currencies within the ASEAN region, and that would be an approach I would use for it. Thank you.